Live from Las Vegas. Welcome to day 2 Held Hostage in Vegas. We're a spotlight session here. My name is Evan Edgar. I'm the engineer for the California Compost Coalition, and we expected more people. After what is, I guess, the people on the floor still. It's the first day on the floor, so we're gonna get started because everybody has 20 minutes of information. We got a lot going on out here. But what about you guys first? How many here people are hauling food waste or are haulers? Got a couple over there. Local government has to do those contracts. State policymakers. Any food banks? Yeah, we got a food bank over there. Who else you want to hear? Who else you want to ask out? Is that about it?
Composters.
Composters. I'm a composter. So a couple of years ago, back in, I think it was 2014, federal EPA kind of flipped the script on food waste. They took the hierarchy and we were supposed to source reduce food waste. Then we're supposed to feed hungry people, so the food banks here. Then we feed animals. I got a couple animal feed facilities. Then we can make anaerobic digestion for industrial processes, then composting, and then after that is incineration, and then landfills last. So once they flip the script, and it's nationwide, it's not just in California. I'm from California. We have a lot of policies doing a lot of things to reduce food waste and increase organic recovery. And some people are in source separation and technology. Some people are mixed solid waste. And the biggest thing that we're working on is packaging, where everybody thinks you can dump on the compost industry for bioplastics that are, instead of going to the ocean, now bioplastics is supposed to be composted. The same with compostable paper. And with the China syndrome and the green fence, we have all this mixed paper that used to go overseas, and somehow the compost industry is supposed to do something with that too. So as a composter representing 30 facilities, so some new challenges and what to do with food waste. So this group here today have a nationwide perspective of what's going on out there, and a lot of good history, and we got to build a lot more facilities. So this is the right thing to do. And throughout the presentation, about 15-20 minutes of presentation, 1 or 2 hot questions. We'd be passing the mic around, and then towards the end, if we have time, to have some of a panel discussion. So what we're going to do first is work with Global Green with Madison Griffiths over here on finding pathways to food waste diversion and how to scale programs no matter what the infrastructure. So go for it, Madison.
All right. Oh, it is on. Great. So I'm just going to hop down here because I was not expecting this whole setup. So I'm Madison Gillen. I'm with Global Green, and I'm going to be talking to you today about how we've basically found a way to start a food waste diversion program no matter the infrastructure available. There we go. Okay, so Global Green is a national environmental nonprofit. We have offices in New York, DC, New Orleans, and our headquarters is in Santa Monica. We just celebrated our 25th year. And we basically run a bunch of different programs nationwide underneath the umbrellas of green urbanism and resource recovery. I manage most of our West Coast programs, all waste related, and I'm also the director of our Coalition for Resource Recovery. So a little bit of background. For the past 8 years or so, Global Green has been doing a series of food waste diversion program pilots in multifamily buildings based on the effects of enhanced tenant outreach strategies on increasing participation and diversion. We focus on multifamily buildings because this seems to be one of the greatest challenges in the sector for any type of recycling program. Due to the nature of high turnover rates, you can have a completely new set of tenants from one year to the next. It's hard to keep a consistent recycling program in that type of setting. Also, from our work, we've also learned a few things. You know, food waste diversion programs and really diversion programs in general in multifamily buildings are really, really resource intensive. So it costs a lot of money to send a paid city staff person to knock on every apartment door in the city of LA to talk about recycling and food waste. It's also extremely labor intensive. I spent most of 2016 jumping in and out of dumpsters for these waste audits that come along with these programs. And to be perfectly honest, it's one of my favorite parts of my job. However, I did throw my back out several times. I've been injured a lot. So how do you kind of overcome these challenges while still putting together effective programs where you're able to collect data? So we ended up finding this eco-ambassador program model that has been successfully deployed in cities like Seattle and in Toronto, where you basically recruit motivated apartment dwellers in an area to take more ownership over the recycling programs in their building, and you teach them how to be a waste expert and on-site resource for their neighbors and for their property manager and just for their community in general. And this program has also led to some other programs where we help cities to figure out how they can expand their infrastructure, and I'll go into that in just a little bit. So the case studies we're going to be going through today are starting in New Orleans, as we have an office in New Orleans, and we basically helped residents in that city to be able to divert their food waste where there was little to no existing food waste diversion infrastructure. Then we'll move over to California, where the rest of our case studies will be, as we have kind of a bigger presence and capacity there. We'll talk about our program with Santa Monica, where we help them to launch their first food waste diversion programs in multifamily buildings. We're going to stay in Santa Monica and kind of go through the 3 years of work with them, where we started with the food waste diversion programs in multifamily buildings, and then from what we learned from that initial rollout, we're going to talk about how we are trying to address contamination as well as to optimize the overall waste operations in the city. And then we're going to move south to Indio, which, if anyone in the room is familiar, it's the home place of Coachella Fest. And we worked with Indio basically to help them figure out how they could expand their food waste to biogas processing infrastructure. And then we're going to move over to Riverside, where we did something similar as Indio, only they have the existing infrastructure, but they weren't sure kind of what their feedstock was going to look like in order to meet a certain energy potential quota that they wanted to meet. So starting in New Orleans, again, there was little to no existing food waste diversion infrastructure in the city, but fortunately we were able to partner with a community organization called Compost Now, who was basically setting up compost hubs with the New Orleans Public Library so that residents were able to divert their food waste even though there weren't any collection services available in the city. So Compost Now partners with a private small-scale composter, and with our work together, we were able to help them set up an extra 7 community compost hubs. And from those 7 community compost hubs, they're diverting an estimated 12,000 pounds of food scraps per year. That's only from 7 compost hubs. It's pretty amazing to me. So this is just an example of one way that you could set up a food waste diversion program with the right partnerships that are available if there's really no existing collection infrastructure. Here are just some photos of what those compost hubs look like. So moving over to California, I'm just going to briefly go over 2 of the pieces of legislation that I'm sure many of you maybe have already heard about so far at the WasteExpo. AB 1826 is a mandatory commercial organics recycling bill that basically, as of this year, as of January 2019, requires that all commercial businesses or all commercial accounts, including multifamily, who generate over 4 cubic yards or more of solid waste, not of just organics, but of solid waste, have to set up for organics diversion services. And then SB 1383, which the regs are just getting finalized now, is a short-lived climate pollutants bill that the regulations will take effect in 2022 and basically requires a 50% reduction in organics entering the landfill by 2020. And then personally, one thing that I really love about this bill is that it will also require 20% of edible food waste to be recovered for human consumption. So it's helping to not only incentivize, but to mandate food donations programs. So moving over to Santa Monica, when we first started working with the city in this kind of food waste realm, they had full-scale organics diversion set up for their single-family accounts, and then they were starting to set up their commercial business accounts to comply with AB 1826, but they hadn't really set up their programs for multifamily because it's a big mountain to climb. So we came in offering technical assistance to go out and set up these pilot programs, do door-to-door outreach, talk to their residents, and just launch a few pilot programs. So we were able to launch 12 different pilot buildings, and from these 12 different pilot buildings, with also doing these enhanced resident engagement strategies, so again, doing door-to-door outreach, we were able to divert an estimated just under 13 tons per year. And again, this is from 12 multifamily buildings. Some of them were only as little as 10 units. So something important here to remember is that multifamily buildings, although they're a great challenge, are also a huge gold mine as far as food waste goes, and there's a really big untapped opportunity here if we're able to just figure out the infrastructure that's right for these programs. Here are just some extra photos from what that initial rollout looked like. And then, so from this first rollout, we learned a lot of things. There was a very obvious there was a big need for more education and outreach for residents to figure out what they should be putting into the green bin, what they should be putting into the recycling bin, and that also you can see in kind of that far right photo that some of the waste operations need to be optimized. I mean, the overloading of the bin, the fact that there's a ton of recycling in the bin. So what we figured we would do moving forward is to try out this eco-ambassador model to help overcome that challenge of contamination, because if you are teaching residents how to teach their own neighbors how to properly divert their food waste, how to properly even divert their recycling, then you're able to have boots on the ground workers basically for you in each of these buildings that you have food waste diversion programs set up that can go and do all that outreach for you. So if you, because as a city staff person or an NGO, you're not exactly available to hold the hand of every building that you set up with these programs. However, if they have an eco-ambassador on site, it's literally their job to kind of manage this program, and they do it voluntarily. And so we were able to train about 60 eco-ambassadors with this initial rollout to address contamination and to also just generally expand the program to more multifamily buildings. And then we also tried deploying these waste bin sensors to address the optimization issue. So we used Enevo waste bin sensors that basically use sonar technology to detect in the bin how full it is and when it's being collected. And you can see from that graph, all the data is sent in real time, and they create these really wonderful graphs for you. That red line is the 50% fullness line. So what we found from the buildings that we deployed these sensors at were that their bins a lot of times were only being collected when they were only between like 40 to 60% full. So we were able to make the recommendation to those property managers that they could stand to lessen the frequency that those bins were being collected, which could incur great cost savings for those property managers to then invest that save money into more outreach and education programs for their residents so that they can lessen their contamination issues. And then say this is done on a citywide scale where you're able to optimize, where you're able to take 100 buildings off of a trash route for one particular route in a day. You could then, for example, instead, replace that trash route with a new organics route, so further expanding your capacity to expand your organics program. Oh, whoops. And then also with this initial eco-ambassador program rollout, this program model has spread to 10 additional cities throughout California. And so we've learned a thing or two in that as well. And we've been able to put together this eco-ambassador program guide to implementation for cities to basically go through these 6 steps that we've identified that will help you to create an effective resident outreach and engagement program. So if anyone is interested in that guidebook, I'd be happy to talk more with you offline. So moving over to Indio, we were given the opportunity through the Southern California Gas Company to expand this eco-ambassador program model, and we tried to do that and identify cities to partner with, but through an RFP type of process so that cities could tell us what they needed out of the eco-ambassador program. But what we ended up finding was that cities weren't necessarily ready to roll out these eco-ambassador programs because they didn't have the proper infrastructure to do so. So what we ended up doing with Indio, because they wanted to kind of identify ways that they could expand their food waste collection infrastructure while also increasing their biogas generation infrastructure. This was part of, we were working with the gas company, so we were also trying to figure out how to increase the renewable natural gas entering the pipeline. So we worked with Indio to basically do a feedstock analysis to assess the food waste being generated out of the city so that we could better match that with different technology solutions for them to increase to basically build an anaerobic digester or some type of setup where they would be able to process their food waste into biogas. And so we set up 3 different scenarios, one being a do nothing. They had an existing compost facility, so it would be how much of the city's food waste could be going towards that composting facility, and would it be at max capacity at that point, or what would that amount be? The second one was if they were to set up an anaerobic digester at that composting facility, because the facility had also just been approved for a site expansion. And the third being if they were to set up an anaerobic digester at their corporate yard, which would have been a smaller scale. And so with these technologies, so we also assessed, due to the feedstock coming out of that city, what different technology solutions would be able to handle that food waste, as well as what the energy generation, so the biogas generation that would be coming out of each of those scenarios, as well as feasibility, siting and permitting requirements and recommendations. Moving on to Riverside, last but not least, this was also through that same Southern California Gas Company work through the RFP, but what we ended up finding with Riverside was they didn't have very wide-scale food waste diversion services set up. However, they did have the infrastructure, the processing infrastructure. They just didn't have the collection infrastructure set up due to the hauling rates and their current hauling contracts. So the city of Riverside has a wastewater treatment facility that has 3 empty anaerobic digesters and a hydrogen fuel cell. They were trying to figure out how much feedstock they needed to fill those anaerobic digesters to then meet a certain energy quota that they wanted to be able to generate with that hydrogen fuel cell. So what we did was we helped them to do a feedstock analysis to see if they were to, say, be able to harvest all of the food waste coming out of just the city of Riverside, would that be enough to fill those 3 anaerobic digesters to then meet that energy quota from the hydrogen fuel cell? And what we ended up finding was that the food waste coming out of just the city of Riverside wouldn't be enough to fill that quota. So then we extended our range to a 10-mile radius, to a 20-mile radius. What we ended up finding was that they would need to be collecting food waste from within a 30-mile radius of the city in order to meet that energy quota. So it was just an interesting way of kind of working backwards, where they knew the energy generation quota that they wanted to fill, but just weren't sure how to get there. So some lessons learned from this work: food waste diversion infrastructure can be developed at any stage of adoption. You just might have to get a little creative. Legislation can be an important driver, as it has been in California. However, landfill bans aren't the only solution. In California, they've basically done everything that they can to not have a landfill ban while still getting as much food waste out of the landfill as possible, because we have a lot of different jurisdictions, a lot of different geographies. California is a really big state, and a landfill ban would be really unfair for a lot of these jurisdictions. And so the RFP process allows for informed program design, because you're able to hear from cities what they need specifically. So you're able to kind of tailor design a program. Multifamily food waste diversion programs are tough, but they're not impossible. Partnerships are key, so public-private partnerships are key in order to make these programs successful. And then community empowerment keeps programs sustainable. So if you have an educated and empowered community, then they will basically do the work for you to keep these food waste programs sustainable and effective over time. And that's all I have for you. Thank you for your time.
Good stuff. So Madison, I have a question. What Madison talked about, the laws in California, is not about landfill diversion or capacity. It's about greenhouse gas reductions and climate change. As part of it, there's a lot of cap and trade money to fund programs. And what you said about food recovery and 20% got to be edible food recovery by 2025. And there's a social justice aspect of it for disadvantaged communities. So any infrastructure in California, we have to have a food waste recovery for edible food as well. And it's funded by cap and trade money for about $9 million. So Madison, what type of programs do you have working with the food banks in order to, on the front side, to promote edible food recovery?
So we haven't really worked with food recovery very much so far. However, we are just starting a program with the city of Santa Monica, where we're going to be hosting a food forum in the city to basically work with all the food businesses in the city to develop a food donations and recovery program that will fit the needs of the city of Santa Monica. So that's kind of how we're starting to dip our feet into the food recovery world.
Yeah, and one of the bills that Madison talked about was AB 1826, was commercial collection, mandatory commercial collection. I represent a lot of Italian garbage haulers in California. At first, they didn't really understand this edible food recovery program, and then I kind of talked about the Pope and Catholic guilt about wasting food and stealing from the poor. That all of a sudden, I got all the Italians on board. We're supporting the grants. Every program we get on cap and trade, I do about a $3 million program for infrastructure. We do about $100,000 to $200,000 towards the edible food recovery, and we're on the front lines doing education with the generator. So now we got the garbage companies promoting edible food recovery as part of the outreach program. So it's been a highly successful program, and it's working quite well. There was another round of grants that just got awarded for another $3 million. So great presentation, Madison. But is there any one hot question from the crowd that you want to ask now for Madison? Over here.
I'm just curious, so for your case study, you showed the Riverside one and then the one in
Can you wait for the mic, please? We're being recorded. We're on Spotlight here. So you're on Spotlight with a mic.
For the case studies that you showed, the Riverside one and the one prior to that, what did they end up deciding, and did they mandate that food waste get diverted so that they could justify the investments in the biogas facilities?
Sure. So those two case studies were only just in last November. So those reports and the feedstock analyses that we were able to produce for them were used to start conversations with City Council and with their planning commissions and whoever else is involved in deciding whether or not those facilities are built. So they were able to be used basically as a justification for this. So look at the energy generation potential that we could have if we start diverting our food waste using these technologies. As far as where that's ended up now, I'm not completely sure.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks, Madison, for the great presentation. All right. Next up, we're going to talk about cost-effective programs, residential commercial programs at zero waste events in a rural case study. Well, about 10 years ago, I went to Burning Man. It was up in Middle Nevada, and we had a zero waste event. And I was an eco-ambassador, and I was a garbage man that went around and collected all the cans. So we can have zero waste events at rural events. So we have a think tank out of Michigan. We have Elisa Seltzer here, to give a presentation.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to see if I can see this from up here. Let's see if this will work. All right. Hi. So I'm going to be talking today about food recovery for commercial customers, residential, and zero waste events. So I am with RRS, Resource Recycling Systems. We are a full-service consulting firm, and we have been at the forefront of organics management, waste recovery, and corporate sustainability since 1986. My full disclosure is that up until this past year, I worked for Emmett County, Michigan as their Public Works Director. So the program I'll be talking about, I spent about 30 years implementing and managing, so I know the program very well. So Emmett County is a very rural community in northern Michigan, and it's right on the Great Lakes, right on Lake Michigan, very beautiful, very big tourist and resort community. So a lot of wealth on the coast and not so much further inland. And it's, for those of you that have actual operations, managing demand for a population where it doubles in the summer, triples in July, and 1 million people pass through on the way to Mackinac Island. So this is a population of a county of only 32,000. So lots of challenges there in designing. So Emmett County had been working with RRS since the late 80s and has developed really a model rural program that's recognized across the country. So there's a solid waste transfer station at this one main site, a MRF, so they're processing plastics there, a full collection fleet for recyclables, and a compost facility, as well as hazardous recyclables and bulky recycling and all kinds of other things. So Emmett County did a lot of things right in terms of it's totally self-funded. There are no county general fund dollars going to support the program and have not since 1990. So very sound policy, best practices, a lot of community engagement, and a lot of regional collaboration to provide economies of scale for the programs. So they've become very cost-effective, comprehensive, and convenient. So I want to show you some of the infrastructure we had because this is an example of how you can make do and modify with a not very big budget. So Emmett County started with rural recycling drop sites, and we used a hook lift truck, lifting containers off the ground to service them. In 2004, Emmett County added residential recycling at the curb, and very quickly added commercial collection and has now grown to over 500 businesses on a weekly recycling collection route for dual stream recycling. What we found is that we got some very strong potential for early adopters. The restaurants loved us. The hotels loved us. They basically said, recycling is a no-brainer. Just get it to the curb. Emmett County does the rest. Why would we not do it? It saves us money. So switching to the composting, Emmett County has composted yard waste since 2004, and it's very low tech. We are talking front loader, windrows, and it is, it is a labor of love, but produces a really, really beautiful compost. Emmett, it was all drop off at the time. Emmett actually took yard waste, grass clippings, brush, and also evergreen separately, so they made a separate evergreen mulch that they sold as well. So when Emmett wanted to get into food scraps, it's like, let's get scrappy. How can we do this? What can Emmett bring to bear to this next new challenge at waste diversion? So Emmett had the policy framework. They had flow control to the transfer station. They had pay as you throw, so people had incentives to reduce their waste stream. Emmett had existing infrastructure. There was the compost facility. There were the collection trucks. And we had those early adopters. We had the restaurants that were already committed to recovery, saw how it saved them money, and wanted to do more. So that was really critical. So Emmett knew they wanted to do a pilot. They wanted to test it out, but they had no idea where to begin. Do we start with residential? Do we start with commercial? Do we do a little of both? With residential, should we do yard waste and food scraps together in large carts or just food scraps at the curb? No clue. So as they did with every phase of Emmett County's development of all these programs, Emmett turned to RRS, their consulting firm, and said, help us with this. And initially they actually said, you guys know what you're doing. You got a facility, you got trucks, just do it. We said, no. We really want help. We want a feasibility study. We want to know what could grow to be and where we start. So we ended up asking them to look at all these different variables. What could a pilot look like? Give us some options and evaluate our site. Can this very low-tech compost facility handle food scraps? And that's something that the DPW board, the Public Works board that oversaw this department, was very concerned about. They did not want odors. They did not want nuisance vectors. They really were concerned about adding food scraps. And this is when you can say, that's why it's a pilot. So we had to get their buy-in. And so the first step was evaluating the site. So RRS came in and determined that the site was actually adequately sized and buffered, even with a full rollout, commercial and residential. And so that was a huge check the box, let's move on. We recognized that the DPW had only authorized $50,000 from the enterprise fund. And that's hard-earned revenue because Emmett had to cover every penny spent with penny earned with its services. And so $50,000 was authorized, the assumption being about $25,000 went towards capital improvements, modifications to the truck, purchase of carts, and then the other $25,000 would be the combination of paying for the feasibility study as well as the operating costs, both for the collection fleet and for the operating of the compost facility. Also recognizing a full program rollout would require big, fancy organics collection vehicles, which Emmett was in no position at the time, but recognizing, okay, this would be a $500,000 investment were we to go down that road. So there were many pilots that were suggested as options, and I'm not going to go through them all today for lack of time. However, I will discuss what Emmett chose to do, which is pilot scenario 1, which was to start with commercial establishments, not residential. And so the recommendations were made, don't do any big folks, no hospitals, no casinos. There are all sorts of unique challenges to collecting and processing their material. But a pilot was developed recommending 34 commercial establishments, on average getting 2 bins, and we were looking for a summer pilot because it gets very cold in northern Michigan. We are not ready to deal with foodsicle in our carts. So a 16 to 20 week pilot, weather dependent, and there was an expectation of diversion estimates in terms of volume as well as revenue generation from the finished compost. So I already talked through the capital costs, amortizing the equipment, and the operating costs of about $6,000 for that short 4-month pilot. So what were our goals? We really wanted to test the ability of our facility to handle the material. We wanted to test our education and outreach efforts because Emmett County did all of that in-house. I mean, everything. The drivers, the loader operators, and Emmett develops their own education and outreach materials in-house, and so to test using those best practices that we had learned at conferences like this in the past. And then to evaluate the cost effectiveness of the service, because to get the buy-in of those early adopters, we said, we're going to provide this program at no cost for this 4-month period, and then we want feedback. Would you be willing to pay for this in the future? All right, so that's how we brought them in. So for education and outreach, we were very, very disciplined and clear about how Emmett worked with each individual business, and so there was a checklist. What happens in advance of that first meeting? What is expected to happen at that meeting? The preparation they need to do, and then what would happen during the pilot. So everything was clearly laid out in advance, and you can see Emmett's phone number is right there on that sheet, so it was really clear they could reach them at any time. Also developed with RS's recommendations to the county to start with back of house only. Emmett wanted to start really conservatively in terms of the kind of material they took, because it was their compost facility, it was their end product, and they had this board of public works members that were very, very concerned about problems. And so back of house only, no plastics, but would take meat, bones, dairy, and paper waste. So when Emmett went in with those one-on-ones, they determined things like, where's the cart gonna go? What kind of preparations will you make for back of house collection? And Emmett developed a whole range of communication tools for the businesses so they could have as many labels and signs and posters, whatever sizes as they wanted throughout the pilot. So this is what the truck ended up looking like, which is why I wanted to show you earlier that Emmett started with recycling drop site collections, because there's one of those trucks, and modified the truck and modified a container. So that's a Perkins cane lift, so added a cart tipper to it, cut open a top in the container, and added a 100-gallon water tank with a spray hose so driver could rinse out every cart after every service, and away we went. So the big capital purchase were the 64-gallon Cascade carts. That image, that's the label. I mean, it was really bright and clear, and feeding farms and gardens, not landfills, is the tagline. So again, following some best practices where if people know where it's going, they might say, oh, I wouldn't put a ketchup packet in a garden. So helping get that message across. So here you can see some carts that this looks like probably from a florist sitting in front waiting for the truck to do its tipping. And I wanted to share a few images from some of the businesses just to give you an idea of the range. Stafford's Hotel and restaurants, they actually have 3 locations in the community. And what I love about that first picture is that you can see their recycling bin right there with their number 10 tin cans, you know, back of house, right next to their buckets full of food scraps. Here's a flower shop. They literally said with recycling and composting with this recovery program, they literally had no garbage left. So talk about zero waste. This was really the piece of the puzzle that we were looking to fill. Emmett added a grocery store. They really wanted to test what unique challenges, what's going to come up with these different medium-sized businesses with their food scraps. And they said this was a total no-brainer. And that's the owner of the grocery store saying, we don't have to worry about separating stuff. It can all go in there. They take care of it. The New York restaurant. This is a fine dining establishment. And there are 2 things I love about this image. One is that they literally have a pickle bucket for scraps sitting inside their garbage can, all right? There is not much room in some of these kitchens, and that was their innovative way of making space. The other thing I love is that the owner, the chef owner of this restaurant, also happens to sit on city council. And so talk about having the change makers and the decision makers actually using the program and being able to speak to it is pretty cool. This is just an example of how we really had to accommodate, you know, would a very aesthetic, where it's important, you know, high class sort of, you know, golf club with this amazing view of Lake Michigan, would they be willing to do a food scrap program? And yes, they were. And this also shows a best practice where the driver was trained to actually look in every single cart before it was tipped and communicate back to our accounts representative or Emmett's account representative if there are any issues. So there's a really strong communication stream between our outreach person, the Emmett's account person, and the driver, as well as the compost operator. So some of the takeaways were that by really testing with so many different kinds of businesses, there was a food bank, a senior center, a care facility, bakeries, florists, grocery stores, and restaurants. There was a lot of takeaway. Every single business was surveyed at the end of this. Every single one wanted to continue service. They could not believe we were ending it for the winter. Like we said, there is a full stop here. This was a pilot. Everyone wanted to continue. Every single one said they were willing to pay for that service. So we said, Emmett will be back in the spring. So that was pretty neat. The other thing is what we saw, like with the food bank, for instance, they realized that there was some food capture that they couldn't give to their clients. Say, for instance, a dented can. You can't, the food's perfectly good inside, they cannot give a dented can with food inside, but they were willing to invest in a can opener, an industrial can opener, so that they would empty the contents of those cans for food scrap recovery and then recycle the can. So that was some of their waste that they were able to reduce. The other thing we noticed is that when the chefs got involved in adding a food scrap recovery program, they became much more cognizant of the waste that was going on with their food prep people. So there's a lot of food waste reduction going on just by rolling out this pilot. So I just want to show you a couple images of what it looks like when the truck is dumping. It's food scraps, and there's always a nest underneath, so Emmett would create a bed of carbon. It could be mulch, compost, leaves, wood chips, whatever they had on hand, to make sure there's something to capture that high nitrogen source and capture any moisture. You can see the driver rinsing the truck, so always doing that after the end of every collection day. And then immediately covering that food waste with carbon source. Sometimes this was the truck driver getting out of the truck and getting into the loader. So this is very, small, like do what works. If there wasn't a compost operator, loader person available, they would do it themselves. They knew it was important. So here's some of what the actual numbers worked out to be. So you can see the feasibility study at the top, just under $15,000. Some of the design work that went into the truck modifications, the cane lift, the carts, et cetera. So the whole program came in at just over $42,000 when $50,000 was authorized. So from a budgetary standpoint, that was a success. So before I move on to residential food scrap recovery, I just want to share that where things have gone. I have the numbers at the end, but what was really amazing is in its second year in 2016, Emmett took it year-round, added compostable cart liners so that we would get away from the foodsicle problem in our negative 10 plus minus degree winters that can go on for weeks. And some of the businesses actually wanted to invest in using liners year-round. Others didn't. Regardless, the driver would still rinse each cart out. And so it's been a very successful program, and you'll see the numbers, how much the volumes have grown. So residential food scrap. Emmett took a really different approach to this, and there we go. So you've probably already seen this a dozen times, so I won't dwell on this, but Emmett really wanted to do the best practice of starting with source reduction, edible food rescue, home composting, before we moved to what I would consider Emmett's probably medium scale, locally based compost program. And so they started with a compost bin sale to give people the opportunity to learn about how one can compost food scraps at home. They then secured a community foundation grant, which allowed Emmett to develop a whole education and outreach program around food waste reduction. This included having a booth at the farmers markets. This included giving away kitchen caddies for free, with the caveat that you are getting a whole toolkit of recipe cards inside that had all these different tips and tricks to reduce the food waste in your own home. Each person had to sign a pledge saying that they would take one of several actions to reduce their food waste. That's considered a best practice to get people engaged and committed. And then Emmett got their email. And that was beautiful because Emmett got a really high response rate on the surveys, and we learned some interesting things at the end. They were also given the address, location of the drop-off, and where they could bring their food scraps 6 days a week. So here's an example of the farmer's market tent and Emmett's volunteers and interns who are absolutely fabulous, some kids dropping off some food scraps. And it's amazing to go to a farmer's market and see people showing up with their little caddy to dump off their food scraps before they buy their vegetables. I mean, it became a thing. People were like very proudly like connecting those dots, which is pretty exciting. At the main drop-off, Emmett also added cooking oil recycling, and so that became a popular add-on there. Again, available 6 days a week. So some of the takeaways were that what we learned from the survey is that of all the people that got a free caddy, participated in the program, and followed up on the survey, half of them were actually composting in their backyards, and the other half were using the drop-offs, and everyone asked about the convenience of curbside collection. So it's kind of a beautiful result because now Emmett has a 5-year plan to start building the case for collection of food scraps. So just, I'm running out of time, so really quick, zero waste events, the first and the largest. So last year, Emmett covered a spaghetti dinner for the Rotary Club, 600 attendees, and it was a very good first step for a first zero waste event. They had never reclaimed anything, no recycling, no nothing. The second year, they had 900 seated in or takeout, and by partnering with the food co-op for the compostable ware, we're able, for 900 people being fed less than one garbage bag. And what they learned in the second year was no more balloons and no more pats of butter. We're going to do slabs of butter because we don't want any waste. So really cool how invested they got. The largest zero waste event was a music festival called Bliss Fest. 10,000 people, camping, lots of food vendors, a 3-day event. And Emmett had already been providing recycling for years. So they added using Clearstream containers, food, compostables, and paper. And as you can see, there's always a volunteer wearing gloves with extra bag liners to help educate on the way. And the tagline for that was, leave no trace, think zero waste. So that became very popular. Big back of house effort there on recycling as well. So here are the numbers. This is down to the last slide here. You can see commercial collection alone, in only 4 years since that feasibility study, over 1 million pounds in this small community of food scraps recovered. So pretty cool for like this, you know, grassroots effort, figure it out. The other neat thing is you can see how much the volumes have grown at the drop-off center. In the farmer's market, the neat thing is as much food is collected in the 8 months of winter as the 4 months of spring through fall. So it's worth doing that extra collection. So from one study and just a few years, working with RRS and using all the tools available of this really scrappy program, Emmett County, although small, had a really mighty outcome. And I thank you for your time.
All right, well, thank you. Well, I couldn't see the pictures up here, but what my big question is, the big trend with compostable serviceware and foodware, and a lot of these events, all the vendors have compostable paper, bioplastics, and what's the challenges there, and how do you separate them? Do the composters want that? I know later on in a program we'll be talking about Richard's going to talk more about it, but what was your challenges there?
So that's something that, again, Emmett was very, very, very concerned about the quality of what was coming in, because there's really no sorting opportunity. It's the driver looking in the cart, and then it's, you know, it may get filtered out at the end, but there's a lot of concern. So while there might be interested in PLAs in the future, they pretty much, in the short term, was like, if it looks like plastic, we don't want it. The compostable liners, Emmett actually provided for the businesses. If they wanted a cart liner, they got it from Emmett County, you know, at cost. So that was something to control that. The compostable ware is still a work in progress for them. So they really, you know, it's small enough still where they can vet what people are using and whether we think it can work in their system. So it is a work in progress.
Yeah. Any one question from the crowd out there for Alyssa? We got right over. Wait for the mic as we are being spotlighted.
Hi there. So this is just kind of sheer curiosity because I am in Oakland, California, and we do not rinse the compost bins. And I'm just wondering how that decision was made and if it's gray water that you're using or fresh water. Obviously, coming from a drought state, so water is a huge concern, so just curious.
That is a really good question. It ended up being a huge issue with the restaurant owners where it was important to them. So it was something, you know, there's actually, I think there's continuing work. It's a 100-gallon tank. I'm not sure exactly how long it lasted them, but it's a pretty high pressure, small nozzle, so it's not actually using a lot of water. It's really the pressure to get the food dislodged from the side, and then it all just dumps into the cart and gets absorbed by the food scraps that are in there. So, yeah, it's a good question, though. Yep.
All right, well, thank you very much. Next up, we're going big, from rural to regional. So we got John Cook here. He's a director of water and resource all the way from Iowa. He's going to do a program about organic recovery program. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am definitely the odd man out at this conference. I'm a water guy. I've operated about 60 water and wastewater treatment facilities between Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, and Iowa. And here I am at a solid waste convention. I don't know how I ended up here, but we're going to find out. I actually have given this talk about 13 times since March. I forgot what I sent here, so we're all going to be excited at the next slide because I don't know what's coming next either, right? Okay? So we're going to have fun anyway. Like I say, I'm the water guy in Muscatine, Iowa, so there's not a whole lot of food recovery going on there as well. We're kind of in the middle of the coast where all the action seems to be happening. I'm kind of glad to see some more Midwesterners here with me, kind of backing me up on that. And I am a paid government employee. I have no profit motive to this at all, so I'm just kind of crazy enough to do this. You know, I was really excited about actually having some food recovery. I see a lot going into our landfills. I went to some sustainability conferences in Dubuque, Iowa. Maybe some of you have heard about that one. And I just got excited about it, and I saw the potential, so we're kind of moving on. And I got our community excited about it, got our city council excited about it, and everybody just kind of wanted to move anyway, even though there's no mandate for us in Iowa to do this, so we just do it because it's the right thing to do. So we are calling our project MARV. It's the Muscatine Area Resource Recovery for Vehicles and Energy. Now, I've run about 40 wastewater plants, and none of them were resource recovery facilities because back in the day, we didn't call them resource recovery facilities. This is a relatively new thing to call a wastewater treatment plant, but it's more apt to what we do. We do recover resources in many different ways, and since we are now going to food, I changed the name of our treatment plant to the Resource Recovery Facility from the Water Pollution Control Plant, because that just doesn't make any sense anymore. That's not what we're doing. But this is what we're going to be doing here in Muscatine. Hopefully we've spread this around a little bit. What is a Muscatine? I was asked that the other day too, or a couple weeks ago. Well, a Muscatine is a city, and it's actually named after some of the Native American tribes that were around there. We're right there in the middle on the Mississippi River, a little ways from Chicago, downstream from about 250,000 people in the Quad Cities. So we have a pretty good area to cover, and we made the world's pearl buttons before they made plastic buttons. In case you're wondering what we did in Muscatine that made us famous, we're the pearl button capital of the world. Now you know. I'm sure you were all wondering where your buttons came from before they were plastic, right? We have 3 Fortune 500 companies that started in Muscatine, so we're a pretty entrepreneurial little community, and what else did they say? Oh, large agriculture and food processing, of course, in Iowa. We're all about the food processing and ag, right? So this is not just a talk about a project. This is, MARV is really more of a movement, and we're kind of really focusing on that aspect because a movement is more than just a project. You know, I could say I'm building a high-strength waste receiving facility. Right? Just flows off the tongue, doesn't it? No. So MARV really starts at the very top of this EPA triangle, and you've all seen this, the food level, and we're about the 4th best option. And we want people to know that this is not something that we're trying to build so that you bring food waste to the wastewater treatment plant to make gas and fertilizer. We want to really start this as a program that goes all the way to the top at source reduction, feeding animals, and then, of course, you know, everything else in between. So it really helps to sell it. If you're in a small community or if you're trying to sell this to a government, you want to sell it as something that's really a movement, something that's really exciting, something they can really get their teeth into, because if you just say, I think you should start tasting food waste at your wastewater plant, you are probably going to get a lot of sideways looks and might get kicked out, okay? But I guarantee you that wastewater plant directors, resource recovery facility people are very, very motivated by what their community is. So get in there, get their attention about how it's going to help the community, all the things that it's going to do, all the benefits, all these other processes that are going along with the program, so that they feel they're a part of a larger program instead of you just wanting to dump stuff on them, okay? So some of the things that we're doing in our town, we have the city blogs and email blasts, different things like that. You can read up and down the list of some of the things that we have. In school rallies is a big one. I had a high school group that came to me and asked me to compost all this food, and unfortunately our compost facility is very close to the soccer fields and the baseball diamonds for just yard waste, and that stuff doesn't stink very bad. I'm like, if you guys start adding food to that, it is going to stink really bad. So no, we're not going to compost, but we can grind it up and take it into the wastewater plant, and we'll make fertilizer and energy out of it. And if you get school kids involved and excited about these things, your project will go a lot further than if you do it any other way. So get the kids involved. That's a great way to go. Then, of course, we feed people. Second, we have our food bank in town has an email blast that goes out to these food sites, like in my church, that serves a meal. And so when they get a big shipment of stuff in and they don't know what to do with it, this email blast goes out, and then people know exactly what's in the food bank, so they can go down and get it and serve people. And I thought that was a really good idea. I have never heard that before. So different kinds of things like that. Again, the school kids were forced to take a fruit every time. I had to put food on their